I'm Dr. Alvin Thomas. My work and this show is dedicated to educating, validating, elevating, and celebrating the importance of Black fatherhood. This is the Black Fatherhood Podcast. There is a Black mental health crisis in our world today, and it is tied to disproportionately high rates of chronic illness, poverty, undereducation, unacknowledged and untreated trauma, and structural racism. Depression, anxiety, and suicide were increasing before the global pandemic, but have since escalated even further. In order to reclaim a life worth living, you must first reclaim your mind. Today, we're talking about steps that we can take towards addressing and improving Black mental health. Dr. Rheeda Walker is an award-winning professor, psychologist, and expert scholar who has published more than 60 scientific papers. She's also the author of the bestseller, The Unapologetic Guide to Black Mental Health. Dr. Walker has been cited or appeared on countless media outlets, including the New York Times, the Washington Post, Good Morning America, and the Breakfast Club, among many others. Dr. Walker is a Georgia native who resides in Houston, Texas. Thank you so much for meeting with us today, Dr. Walker.
Absolutely. I'm really glad to be here.
Awesome. So if we could start off with just a general, honest assessment of mental health in the Black community, and then tell us whether or not that really differs from mental health in other communities.
I can say as a longtime university professor, my first thought is to maybe give us a grade when you ask about assessment. And that grade would probably be a C, to be honest. And what that means isn't that everyone is functioning at a C level, but it's like when we look at our aggregate, when we look at our community as a whole, I'd probably give us a C. Honestly, because one, we experience a lot. I mean, you name a gap and we fall into it. You know, the income gap, the housing gap, education gap, health, you name it. There are a lot of things that are coming our way. And at the same time, there's been this erosion of who we are as a community that makes it harder for us to be able to navigate these challenges. And I'm not convinced that we see the cliff that is just in front of us.
That is interesting. That image of a cliff ahead of us and walking almost blindly to it is both vivid, striking, but also scary. Do you think the community is aware? Do you think the medical community is aware of this?
I would say no, to be honest. And that's why I wrote the Unapologetic Guide to Black Mental Health. Because for me as a scholar who has been for the better part of 2 decades tracking statistics and suddenly seeing the suicide death rate increase for 5 to 11-year-old Black children when it was actually going down for white European American children, I was alarmed. And these are data that, as I mentioned, I've been tracking. And so my first thought with the book was to sound the alarm, like people don't know this is happening. And for me, when it starts with children, that suggests that there's something else happening in our larger community.
So that's actually a really good segue, because I want to try to understand, because somebody might be listening to this and might be thinking, well, she sounds like an alarmist, like she's making all this noise. Are things really that bad? What would it take? What are some of the antecedents for this mental health crisis that you're seeing?
Well, I think that what comes to mind, and especially for folks who would say, you know, she's an alarmist, you know,
Right.
people around me are doing really just fine.
Right.
And then we find out like, oh man, this person has done something, you know, they end up in a mental health crisis, you know, individuals who we think have it all, who end up hospitalized because of a suicide attempt or even worse, that they have died. And there are a lot of people, I think more often than we know, people who think about suicide, but they may dull the depression and the anxiety in other ways, you know, sometimes through substance use, binge drinking, spending money to, engage in a lifestyle to protect the pain and hurt that folks are carrying. There are a lot of folks that, because we have this mantra in our society that you don't look like what you're going through, that there are a lot of people who are struggling, that it just gets missed. And for some folks, it takes a small trigger of something to just push them over the edge. And then folks are saying, well, I had no idea. I didn't know what was going on. And I think that's part of what concerns me. And then we don't notice, or we don't have the capacity to see, when a 10-year-old, takes their own life. And that concerns me as someone who pays attention to the data.
And I think of the flip of that. We often don't pay attention to the symptoms. So we suddenly get all freaked out when a 10-year-old suicides, or when a 15-year-old steals a car and goes joyriding. But we missed the signs, we missed the red flags, or we saw them and didn't think of them as anything. Oh, they're just seeking attention. Oh, they're just a bad kid. How could we get people to start to rethink? So, for example, one of the things that I keep seeing on my TV almost every evening is about this rise in crime in a number of different major cities. Small groups or large groups of young people are going out into the streets and doing foolish things, or going into stores and raiding stores. And I keep looking at this and saying to myself, this is not what we've been accustomed to. This is a new behavior. And if it's a new behavior, it's suggesting to us that it is an antecedent of something to come. Does that resonate for you?
Well, it's an interesting observation, because I am curious to know what is happening in the minds of these groups of young people. And I won't begin to suggest that I do. But one of the things that we know is that we have groups of young people who kind of operate on the periphery. In a lot of ways, people in the Black community operate at the periphery of our society, being unseen, not having sufficient education and educators who look like them, and not having structure, and most importantly, not having a sense of hope that things will change. And that's part of the concern, this sense of hopelessness that really, some behaviors may not, it just doesn't seem like it matters because they don't matter as young people. Again, it would be great, to talk to some of these individuals. But when I do talk to young adults and young people, there is just this sense of despair and hopelessness in our society. But as you mentioned as part of the introduction, there's economic despair. Like, we cannot disconnect our emotional health and well-being from individuals' capacity to survive and thrive in our greater society.
So this feels like a really huge issue. And of course, we can't leave it to families to change this issue. We can't leave it to children to address this issue, this thing that's going on with them. We have to think of systems beyond the family, beyond the community, beyond the individual. What can we do as a society? What can we do as a school, as a church, as whatever the organization happens to be, as policymakers? What can we do to help address not just the outcome, but the antecedents of these outcomes? So not just the suicide, but the factors that lead us to that point of suicide.
I so appreciate that question, because a big part of the work that I do in my narrative is prevention. So, and it's as simple as, if you see someone who is struggling, like, don't wait until they get to a place where they can't come back or recover from that struggle. Go to them. And this is at the individual one-on-one level. Like, hey, I know that you recently went through fill in the blank, and I just want you to know I'm here. Offer a solution. Say something like, hey, I want you to come over for dinner, or let's get lunch. Like, there are small things that we can do. We don't always need these sort of big Herculean efforts. Because as an example, you mentioned that, we don't want to leave it to families, but when it comes to the Black community, that may be where we need to start.
Yes.
Because if we over rely on our larger society to, come to our rescue, then we might be waiting longer than we would like. And so that's why we have to be mindful of our capacity to be able to be our brother's keeper, as an example. Because if I'm stressed and overwhelmed, or if you're so depressed you can't connect with someone else, then it's important to be able to get that addressed either with a professional or maybe with someone else who isn't overwhelmed, so that that person can then extend themselves to the next person. Historically, we've been able to support one another when we didn't have government or anyone else to provide what was needed. Like the community did that for itself. And that's one of the things I also talk about in the book, that recognizing that there is a lot of peril, there's also overwhelming resource in the community. But we have to be able to recognize that first and then be able to tap into it.
I love that. I really love that. And it hints to this thing that you talk about in your book as well. You talk about this legacy of survival within the Black community. Talk to us a little bit about what this survival looks like and how this may look for Black fathers specifically. How might Black fathers help to shift this legacy of survival for their children?
Well, it comes from our culture. I'll start there. So people define culture in a lot of different ways, but at its most basic level, culture is our capacity to be able to pass down systems of survival from one generation to the next. Like, this is how we survive. And I teach that to my son, and he hopefully teaches that to his children, and so on and so on. And so what was passed on to me from my parents was, well, you're going to have to work twice as hard to get half as far. Like, that is how I was expected to be able to survive. My parents had to survive in their own ways. And so part of what we have to recognize is, first and foremost, like, what do we have at our disposal? Like, what do we have to be able to deal with police brutality, to be able to deal with injustice, and not just via police systems, but also at work and at school and things of that nature? And how do we adapt so that in the 21st century, and we're about to, go into a new year, how do we adapt so that we use most effectively the resources that we have? We have a large Black middle class, and some individuals, I think, have adapted by saying, well, I'm going to be, or I'm going to try to assimilate, and I'll figure out how I can be or not Black or not connect with the African American community. And that's how I survive. And for some people, that's just fine. I question that it'll get them very far. I talk about this in the book. But for those who are willing to say, okay, how do I best connect with the community in order to foster the kind of survival that predated me, and leverage it in ways using new resources, using technology, using social media responsibly, of course. How do I now create what we need in our community?
You talk about this cultural investment. You talk about this survival. But our culture has changed. Our culture has adapted over time, and it doesn't look the same. It's seemingly more individualistic. It seems like we only hear from each other when there's a major thing. So there's George Floyd, we all show up. And then once it seems like the attention has died down, the pain is not as acute and sharp as it is, we kind of go back to our apartments or to our homes or to our cars or wherever it is that we go, and we seclude ourselves until the need to come back out again. There's this cultural investment, you see, in not telling folks your business. And it seems like that's a newer thing, because it used to be that we were so close together, maybe because of the poverty, because of the shared oppression, that we were sharing physical space with each other. So I knew what was happening with my friends' kids and my friends' daughters and my friends' relationship. And now it seems like you say, there is this cultural investment in not telling folks your business and not letting folks in. And that can prevent someone from asking for help. So you talk about leaning on people, but people don't even want to open up to be leaned upon or to say that they need to lean. Let's talk a little bit about this cultural investment, as you call it.
There are layers to this one, as is probably all of these topics. And I'm trying to think, where do I tackle this first? I think probably just this idea of first people not being in one another's business.
Yeah.
Because that's one of the number one things that I hear about people saying they don't want to reach out for help. And especially men and also women who say, well, I want to get help, but I don't trust these people. And that's what it boils down to, is this sense of trust. But if you think about it, trust is also, a way of surviving, figuring out who are the trustworthy people. And that's why individuals have to invest in figuring out who the people are that they can trust non-judgmentally before the crisis happens. And that's part of what I talk about, not just in the book, but a lot of different places, that we have to create what we need before there is tragedy. And I'm convinced that there are some of your listeners who have ideas like, oh, wow, okay, they can take the baton, run with it, and create what's needed so that when folks say, okay, here we go again, it's another George Floyd situation, because odds are it will happen. It has happened, just not to that level of visibility that we saw during the pandemic. But when something happens, I will have what we need to be able to come together and have a soft space, a landing space, so that there isn't this sort of, chaos or a sense of loss and the prolonged pain that people experience.
I love this phrase that you kind of just said, investing in these relationships and investing in them before the crisis. I think often we start doing this mad scramble for assistance when the crisis is on. So we're trying to put out a ton of fires, not realizing that we could have built a better house. We probably could have built sprinklers into the structure. And now we're trying to figure out how to address it after the fact. But building those relationships with the expectation that maybe one day you will need me and I will need you, as opposed to not just I will need you, but you will need me and I will need you. And that to me is community. How then do we get people to start to recognize the need for mental health help? Because often people are like, well, I don't need help. And you're like, actually, you do need help. Like what you're presenting to me as normal, that's not really normal. That's not what people who are doing well are doing. How do you get people to get to the point where they start to recognize the need for mental health?
Well, conversations like this, obviously, are important, where we normalize just talking about emotional well-being and how we can survive more effectively. Because many of us have been surviving. We're still here, right? We're still present, but we don't live quality lives. And I will tell you that as a clinical psychologist, what I say to, clients that I'm overseeing, because I don't provide direct clinical care, but I supervise clinical cases, the threshold is when the person is not able to function to the degree that they would like, either on their job, with their family and in relationships. Maybe they don't have hobbies. Maybe they don't have friends, and they're just not operating at a place that they want to be. And so that person can probably benefit from some professional care, or better yet, they could benefit from picking up my new workbook, the Unapologetic workbook. Because when we first recognize, first and foremost, like I'm too distracted, I'm having difficulty sleeping, I'm yelling at these kids, I'm yelling at my spouse, and this isn't who I want to be, that's a clue. Like that's a clue for anyone. And also for anyone who says, oh, I wonder if I need to talk to somebody. The answer is yes. Like it's a yes, full stop, because professionals allow individuals to, they're degreed and licensed to help people figure out if they can benefit from some type of professional care. I think that might have been 1.5 layers that I caught in there, but let me know the follow-up question.
Nope. I think that's a good 1.5 layers to start with, because I think often it's difficult to take that first step. And if that is the first step that people can take to get through the door, then if we can get them through the door, that's a good first step. So there's the obvious that men and women recognize the need for help differently, ask for help differently. In fact, the usual suggestion is that men don't ask for help, men don't talk. And I have a very different view about whether it is that men don't talk. And maybe we'll jump into that view. But are there more barriers for men to men asking for help? And what might those barriers look like?
I think, again, it comes down to just cultural phenomena and whether or not it's okay to seem weak, which there is a gendered perspective on looking weak. So women may be more likely to ask for help, and there's different kinds of help. Maybe that's also useful to distinguish. So it may help to think about just differences in types of support. So we have emotional support, that women are more likely to be vulnerable with other women, people they feel comfortable with. And men may be more likely to engage in instrumental support. That is, hey, I'm struggling with this project. Hey, man, can you come over here and help me out? I can't figure out this, whatever, figure out the thing. And so there's different kinds of support even to be aware of. And so men being inclined to get emotional support is something that could, in fact, look weak for men, unfortunately. I hope that the narrative around that is evolving, as there are men who are talking about mental health care and seeing professionals. But I think overwhelmingly, and it's more anecdotal and people I see, but this notion of getting support, it's challenging. And what I say to individuals is, you don't always have to tell people what it is that you're going through. Like there's levels to support. So if someone is struggling and they're overwhelmed and they're feeling like they're losing their mind, they don't have any solution, folks are getting on their nerves at work, the spouse at home, the kids, it's a lot. And maybe, just maybe, they're also trying to find a job in the middle of it if they're not, in fact, employed. That they can distract themselves in the short term, with adaptive things like, hey, man, can we just go, I don't know, play some basketball?
Right.
Like that is a thing. And maybe they have to borrow some money to go get a haircut. But hey, I'll pay you back, and make sure that they pay that person back just to be in a positive environment. And in those environments, they don't have to talk about what they're struggling with. They just need to put some distance, just a little bit of space between them and the stuff to give themselves room to be able to problem solve. If the space isn't enough, then it's worth saying, okay, what do I really need help with? Do I need some connections with folks to help me find a new job? Like, what do I really need? And to find the trusted person, and that's trusted with a capital T, find the trusted person and tell that individual what they need. So I think we have to think about support and connecting with others in different kinds of ways. And we don't have to just say, well, I'm not going to let anybody get in my business, and then keep things to ourselves and then struggle.
I think there's the barber shop has always been a sacred space for Black men, because it's the one space that exists in the entire country where you can step in and be unapologetically Black and unapologetically male. In maybe some of not the most beneficial ways, but it is a place where you can, pun intended, let down your hair and just be yourself. And in those barbershop spaces, what we often see is that the narrative, but also the schema, or the structure and strategies around asking for help looks different. So what I think is happening is that Black men specifically, but men in general, are asking for help in very different ways. Even you mentioned the idea that asking for help has this very gendered perception. And I think often our service providers, our services are thinking about or expecting a very gendered request for help. And Black men aren't always speaking the same language with providers. And so there needs to be some kind of translation in between. But I want to jump into your book. Your book frequently references the term psychological fortitude. Tell us a little bit about what this psychological fortitude is and why is it so important? And then maybe you could give us some examples of it.
Well, I introduced the idea because it's so incredibly important to me to meet people where they are. And this includes as much of the Black community as possible. And so I know that the idea of mental health just doesn't go very far. People hear mental health and they hear crazy and they run the opposite direction. So psychological fortitude is essentially this 0 to 10 rating of the capacity to be able to manage your mind. You ever been so overwhelmed? You said, I just can't even think right now. To manage your mind, to manage your emotions, to be able to take care of work and school responsibilities, to be able to deny or to navigate threats to your well-being, and to tap into your life purpose. All of those things together, a 0 to 10 rating. And so 0 is I can't do any of that. And 10 is I'm cooking with grease. So as an example, someone who is, say, a 7 at the end of a long day may need to get a, beer or a glass or two of wine because they had a tough day, but they can still get through. They're still doing okay. Maybe they got to order takeout rather than get some food or cook some food, but they're managing okay. Someone who's at a 10, like they're at peak operations. It's hard to get there. But if someone is, at a 5 or lower, say most of the day for several days, it's time to call in reinforcements. And when I talk about reinforcements, it's managing in two different directions. One is trying to remove whatever the stressor is or the stuff that's weighing them down or upsetting them. And then also finding opportunities or sources of joy. And sometimes that is connecting with other people, but sometimes it's just going outside or back in the day, listening to your favorite record. Right. So it varies for different people, but I talk about it with that 0 to 10. 1 is a point of assessment. Where am I at a point in a day or point in the week or year? And then also to be able to say, I have 1 or 2 things, or maybe I need to do 2 different kinds of things, remove something and bring on some joy.
I love this idea of psychological fortitude because I could see Black men buying into that. That to me feels like a bit of that translation of the language of mental health, something that Black men can kind of hold on to. So I think I'm going to use this going forward. In your workbook, you also target a couple of main areas. I want to address 3 of them with regard to building fortitude. You say setting boundaries and saying no, learning how to do that when you're feeling overwhelmed. Talk to us a little bit about that, and then we'll jump to the other 2.
Well, with the first one, and this idea of setting boundaries, as you're being aware of your psychological fortitude, and I assure you, I am always aware of mine, that sometimes we take on things as a part of being members of a community, in our family, neighborhoods, wherever we are. And we take on things when we really don't have the bandwidth for it. But then we feel bad or we feel guilty. And so we avoid that guilt by doing more. And it's important to just be mindful of that so that we can be our best selves and to tap into our best selves.
So we just got out of no November. So maybe we could do some of that no November in December.
Absolutely.
The other 2, I think, are related, so I'll ask them together. So you said the other 2 main areas. One is understanding how racism can impact your mental health and what to do about it, and how to overcome internalized racism and explore meaningful Blackness. Talk to us a little bit about those 2.
Yeah, somehow we've gotten to a place in society where, as I mentioned earlier, a lot of us feel uncomfortable connecting with and identifying as Black Americans or as African Americans. And I've heard, some of the younger generation will oftentimes just say, well, I'm just American, because there's just the resistance and there's this sense of being Black is a bad thing. And that's unfortunate because there's downright superpowerness in being a Black person in this society. But what happens is when there's these internalized messages that being Black is bad, for women, wearing natural hair is bad, speaking a certain way is bad, that becomes problematic. There isn't any community in the US or around the world that can see something inherent in them as bad and thrive. Like those two belief systems cannot exist or cannot coexist. And so we have to be able to recognize that when racism happens, when microaggressions happen, that has more to do with other people and systems outside of us than it has anything to do with who we are as sometimes magical people.
So we're going to close with a piece that I think most fathers who are listening to this are going to be asking themselves, which is, so what should I be doing? So what are 3 of your top suggestions for Black fathers who might be listening in here for building their mental health? You know what? Let me change that. For building their psychological fortitude.
Yes, I love it. Building psychological fortitude. We're starting with being honest. And so even though I give that 0 to 10 rating, it doesn't have to be perfect. You know, people feel like they have to just get this perfect rating, and I get they're overachievers. Wonderful. But being honest about where that individual is so that they can decide whether or not they need to make some adjustments for themselves. And then also recognizing that they can communicate too, that they can, once they're honest, communicate with the people around them in their own due time. I think that there has been a lot of pressure, on men to say, okay, you got to go from 0 to 100 on your mental health.
Real quick.
Every individual listening has to take their own pace, whatever that means, and not should on themselves, which I talk about in the book, about what they need to be doing because someone else said. Every individual can only run their own race. But one of the things that they can do, in all of this is to, a lot of folks don't like to necessarily write. I encourage it because it helps us to clear our minds in really effective, scientifically supported ways. But maybe if, dictating into a recorder, this is what's going on for me. This is what I need to be doing for myself. If I could wave a magic wand and my life could be different in this moment, what would that be? Because waving a magic wand gives us an opportunity to think creatively without limiting ourselves, which happens a lot, without limiting ourselves about how our lives could be different. So I hope those are helpful.
I think those are very helpful. Thank you very much, Dr. Rheeda Walker, for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
In his record song, Heal the World, Michael Jackson has this iconic line where he says that we need to stop existing and start living. Today we spoke with Dr. Rheeda Walker, and she suggested that Black communities, Black people have been surviving for so long. I would extend it to say that we've moved from struggle to surviving, and we have yet to find that space to thrive. How do we get Black families to move beyond the struggle, beyond the survival instincts, and into a space of thriving? It starts with you. Black dads, you need to move into thriving. You need to move out of surviving and out of struggle. And that starts with your own mental health. And let's switch that from mental health to mental fortitude. We spend hours in the gym building our muscles, hours on the court, perfecting our layups and our dunks and our dribbling, hours on the field, perfecting our passes and our tackles. And we spend so little time thinking about ourselves, thinking about our health, thinking about who we are and why we're here and how we're going to accomplish the things that we want to accomplish. Invest before the crisis. Before a mental health crisis, make sure you've spent time, you've invested time in building relationships with people so that they can recognize when you are not your best self. That you can also spend time recognizing when you are not who you want to be. And they can reach out to support you. But just as importantly, you can reach out to your social support systems. Black fathers can be supportive and have been supporting their children, but often to the detriment of their own mental health. The best gift that you could give to your child is to be able to be around for as long as possible, to be able to be there for your child's first dance at their wedding, for your child's first child, for the many other firsts that life has available to you. It is in thriving that we see growth, that we see the extension of legacy. Build your own psychological fortitude. Love your children by loving yourself. You've been listening to the Black Fatherhood Podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Alvin Thomas. I'm a clinical psychologist, researcher, and the director of the TriLab at the University of Wisconsin-Madison's School of Human Ecology. Original music for our series was composed and performed by Micaiah De Silva. Our series producer is Jill Ruby. The podcast is supported by the School of Human Ecology at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. And you can follow me on Twitter at Dr_AT758. That's Dr_AT758. And on the web at thomaslab.humanecology.wisc.edu. Make sure to subscribe to the Black Fatherhood Podcast wherever you listen to your podcasts.